I'm very happy to be here, and we always have had a very good relationships with our friends in Basque region, and we have always enjoyed the cooperation. And yeah, so it's a pleasure to be here again. Alas, in a online version. So I'll talk briefly about mission-oriented innovation and the innovation policy approaches that have been emerging over the last almost 10 years by now, and just sort of almost to a bit of like a stock taking, why we have developed or why many governments are applying missions in their everyday work, and particularly local governments actually are doing that quite a lot. And then I'll talk about some of the examples and also some of the ways that that countries and cities are doing it. So hopefully it'll be a good warm up for your day ahead as well. So one of the key starting points around innovation today is that the nature of innovation has been changing quite a lot. So even if you go back maybe 15, 20 years ago, innovation was mainly understood as like an research, development, science, technology, very much around these kind of areas. So we were thinking about computers and cars, and we wanted to produce them more. We wanted to have more productivity. But we today actually are asking much more also the question, what kind of cars, what kind of computers, what is the ecological footprint of these innovations? And particularly when we talk about, for instance, artificial intelligence, we are increasingly asking, what do we want to do with this technology as a society? What kind of goods we want to produce? What kind of services we want to produce? And hence, there's much more a sense that innovation itself is a quite a political phenomenon, in a sense that we as a society need to work together to shape the direction of innovation. When we think about renewable energy, for instance, in some countries you can argue that nuclear energy is completely acceptable. In other countries, it's completely unacceptable. So these are all political decision-making processes that are then shaping the direction of innovation. And I think this is a very important starting point, particularly for public policymakers, both at the regional level or city level or national level, this understanding that we have to shape the direction of innovation. We have to work together with industry, with universities, with third sector organizations to shape that direction, I think is very important, because it actually really requires from public policymakers quite a different approach to innovation. So we don't think innovation is only about sort of like more and more and more, having more investments, more growth, but it's actually what kind of growth and how do we change the direction of growth. But then as we look at the nature of policymaking, we very often see that policymaking actually happens in this very linear fashion that we think of or what we can call like a Gantt chart policymaking, or a waterfall style policymaking, where we think of a new policy, we design it, we plan it, we implement it, and really don't really engage with stakeholders that much. And we sort of think we know everything beforehand, and we don't really experiment and learn that much in policy space. Hence, policymakers are usually very good at writing 500-page reports and then putting it out there for the public to read or to implement, but rather than actually learn, as we are going along. And so, particularly when we think about the challenges that we face as societies around climate emergency, migration, and other areas, what we call like those grand challenges or wicked problems, this kind of linear policymaking that we plan for a few years, then we put it out there, then we implement it, and then we evaluate policy after a couple of years. This kind of linear policymaking has proven to be particularly ineffective, I think, and this has also led to diminishing trust in governments, and you have all kinds of political polarization emerging as well. And a lot of that has to do with the ineffectiveness of government policies in tackling challenges. And this has then led to what a wonderful American public policy official, actually, Jennifer Polka, has called policy vomit, that we are very much doing more and more policies. We are putting out more and more policy papers and policy guidelines, but at the same time, actually, the implementation is as poor as it was a few decades ago. And again, we are in this cycle of ineffective government, more policies, ineffective government. and again, more policies, and all of that discussion happens there. And that's why I think there's an interest in actually, rethinking mission-oriented policies, because again, particularly the work of Mariana Mazzucato, who was also mentioned in the introduction, has shown that when public policy is done with a big ambition in mind, trying to tackle specific challenges, that can lead to what we can call like spillover effects in other areas as well. So Mariana's work in the entrepreneurial state very much showed this idea that government agencies investing in the future technology around the moonshot and beyond really led to lots of new opportunities. So it wasn't really that much about trying to have just more growth, but actually trying to really shift the way we think about, for instance, space. And actually that then led to a lot of the smart things in our technologies and phones. And this has been the sort of the idea, can we actually take inspiration from this technological focus on solving problems and actually apply it to the other problems in our society as well? So can we actually think of climate? Can we think of inequality? Can we think of migration and other areas like poverty and things like that from a perspective of missions, so that we want to solve that, and in a way that we're trying to solve it actually then is catalyzing lots of actors to work around the same mission. And this time we are not talking only about technological missions, but we are very much talking about actually socio-technical missions around like food systems, about transportation systems, mobility systems, and things like that. And here's an example of the new generation of mission-oriented innovation. So we're not looking at the space race kind of technological challenges, but for instance, the European Union, and I'll talk about it a bit more, has a much broader focus in research and development policies. But you have also private sector putting up their own challenges and challenge prizes. You have Nesta, which is a innovation foundation here in the UK, refocusing their work around three societal challenges, which is around childhood and healthy life, and also thinking about the climate change as well. So again, the innovation is becoming much more social, political, and actually really about how do we live together as a society. But you see here here's on the right-hand side, you see a tweet from Boston Consulting Group, where also big consultancies are trying to talk about creating value for society. What is the business value for society beyond products and services? So I think there's this broader sense that we should try to direct innovation towards the societal goals, and missions are seen as this umbrella that we can all work under and work towards a common goal, yet working in different ways. And hopefully this also then, the idea is that this leads to different policy-making style that is much more engaging, much more stakeholder engaging, but also much more engaging with the citizen and much more experimental, learning as we go along. And this is really the challenge. So how do we build that? And here's like a couple of writings I already mentioned, Entrepreneurial State by Mariana Mazzucato, but also her books around value and mission economy. And here in the middle, there is a journal issue that Mariana and I co-edited around mission-oriented innovation. So if you're interested in these kind of references, get in touch or go to our website. I think one of the really key differences from the first generation of mission-oriented policies during 1960s, 70s, and 80s is that today's missions are not really, as I said, about technology, but it's technology plus lifestyles, plus the way we think about our future. So here's an example of when we think about zero carbon energy, we can achieve that zero carbon energy by combining multiple different technological, but also behavioral changes. We can talk about carbon capture, but we can also talk about grassroots renewable energy. We can talk about nuclear power. We can talk about offshore wind. And again, this, which kind of direction we actually pick within this broader directionality is really very much up to the context you're in, the political compromises we can create, but also the resources we have, the natural resources we have. Not everybody can rely on offshore wind, for instance, and so on and so forth. So, but you have this broader directionality of renewable or zero carbon energy, which means that policymakers but also businesses can cooperate, can align their interest towards this zero carbon energy, because we understand that this is where we want to go as a society, and we have to find the right mixture to get there. So missions shouldn't be really thought about as like a top-down policy making that the government or president or prime minister says this is our mission and everybody works around it. But it's actually much more agreeing on a broad directionality, but also agreeing on quite specific goals within that directionality. And that allows government agencies, local governments, businesses, universities start to sort of align their work around those goals. And that's really the important thing, that you have the sort of the bottom-up engagement and also hopefully experimentation, because different cities can try to use different mixtures of renewable energies and so on and so on. But there is a support available, there is regulatory support available, and so on and so forth. And what is really important to understand is that mission-oriented policies are very much sort of changing a lot of the policy logics that we are used to looking at. And here is an example from innovation policy, but of course you can take similar examples from other areas, from transportation and so forth in other policy areas. And the key, really, the key differences is that a lot of the policy frameworks that we used in 1990s, 1980s, 2000s were really very much focusing around competitiveness. So the idea of policy was to make a region, like the Basque region, or a city like Barcelona or San Sebastian, or a country like Spain, more competitive, in comparison to our international competitors or other countries in the European Union, globally, in other cities, other regions. But we are now much more moving into what are the problems that we actually try to solve as society, rather than thinking about how we are better in competition. So it's actually looking at our domestic challenges as societies, but it's also really rethinking how do we actually think about performance in public agencies? How do we as citizens should be looking at public agencies? How should we as ministers of finance, as auditing agencies, what is the good performance of the public agencies? Also changing. Again, we're really trying to understand whether we're actually solving some of those grand challenges that we are facing as society. And that really also changes the way we think about public organizations. What do we want to do? We want to have much more engagement with the wider actors. We want to have much more trust, legitimacy, because we need to engage wider citizen groups and so on and so forth. But also it has the impact of the way we think about expertise and capabilities in public sector. So it's about the capability of public sector to define the directionality. What is the directionality of our region? And not only the directionality, but what is the combination of different policies, the policy mixes that we here in the Basque region, for instance, are happy with and is helpful for us. It might be completely different in different regions. So how do we actually get to our own mix is what is really important in this context. And here is an example from a Swedish innovation agency, Vinnova, and they were one of the early movers, if you will. So there is on the right-hand corner there, you see there is their small book that they have published over the last couple of years. And they developed two very interesting missions, I always think. One is around food system transformation, and the other one is about transportation and streets and mobility missions. And I think where they started from is sort of, if you see the figure here in the middle, you have this sustainable food, you have a sustainable cup of tea. So if you want to have every school in Sweden to provide sustainable and healthy food, you actually really need to change the entire food system, from energy to production, to waste management, to transportation, to all of those things need to be then sustainable. And again, so if you think about Sweden, is one of those countries where you have around half of the lunches every day are provided by government in schools. Government is paying for school food. So this is not a new money. Government is not spending new money. It's already spending that money. So can you use this money more smartly? And this goes for a lot of public procurement. Governments are spending 20% of GDP through procurement. Can we spend it better? And I think food here is an example where, as you see, this is not a top-down mission to change the food system in Sweden, but it's actually a mission to say we want every school in Sweden over the next decade to provide healthy, sustainable food. And so that requires a work with schools, with children, with with providers, with school leaderships, with local governments, because local governments are the ones that usually run schools in many countries. So and that has enabled Swedish innovation policymakers to have really very, very different approaches in different regions, in different local governments, because it leads to experimentation. So we are learning. So we don't have this like a big 5-year plan to change food system. Remember, this is not a policy vomit. This is not a Gantt chart here, but it's actually iterative, step by step. We are learning from one local government to other, how they are actually dealing with that food innovation. And the same goes for mobility. So Sweden has about 40,000 streets. If you don't talk about highways, 40,000 streets. So you can't have a big plan to change every street in Sweden, but you can provide support to local governments to rethink their streets, to have less cars, to have more culture, to have more commerce. And Barcelona, of course, near you is one of those great examples by the superblocks, how you can do that and how you can really reclaim to have more sustainable and more affordable city as one of those missions. And I think it's a really interesting to see how a lot of cities are actually engaging in this kind of mission-oriented innovation away from research and technology and science, but much more around housing and public services, and actually really engaging with citizens as well. And yeah, as I mentioned already, European Union, of course, I'm sure you know that also really well, that European Union has those 5 mission areas, and they are quite different. So they look at, for instance, at cancer, but also at soil and food systems as well, but also climate neutral, smart cities, and so on and so forth. And so the European Union follows this kind of the logic that there are lots of like financial instruments should help in those areas to develop those solutions. And there's also lots of interesting things happening in Latin America, for instance. Here's a couple of examples from a report Mariana and the colleagues did a couple of years ago, looking at examples around sustainable mining, for instance, in Chile, or looking at smart cities in Mexico and things like that. So there's also lots of international examples actually happening where countries are trying to set these more ambitious goals. Some of them are more technological and looking at technological systems. Others are more around, like for instance, here is an example from Mexico, is around obesity, which is around very much about lifestyles. How do we eat? But this has a lot of impact on health systems, on people's future, employability, all of those things. So you can design those missions in a very different way. And here is sort of, as I said, I think missions, they sound like this top-down big planning exercises, but they are actually exactly not that. So we try to get away from having a big plans, Gantt chart, policy vomit, and very complicated long policy documents, actually into providing this almost like a canvas that different painters, different cities, different agencies can use to have much more iterative policymaking and much more engaged policymaking as well. I think that's really the key learning from here. And here is an example from Australia. CSIRO is an innovation agency in Australia again. So if you look here, they have this. They have around 4 missions at this point. They are working around this 5 to 7 year timeline. But if you look at here in the middle of the slide, you see 3 months, 6 months, 12 months. But this is the policy process they're engaging. They have first 3 months, they have a policy proposals or proposals of various businesses and agencies working together. Then they have a concept stage, then the evaluation of that concept stage, and then they actually help them to scale and launch those missions. But they iteratively learn all the time, they evaluate it. So it's not about having policy after 5 years we evaluate it, but it's actually after 3 months, after 6 months, because all of that time you are doing engagement, stakeholder management, you're working with them towards the same goal. So even if some consortium are not funded, they are still working with you maybe for 6 months. So they learn about these things, they learn to work together. And that's what mission-oriented approach can do to you, to provide this much shorter policy cycles and learning cycles. And ideally that should also be helpful. And I think it's interesting also to see how UNIDO, the UN agency, is sort of thinking about missions in the context of industrialization. So you can see through the lenses of SDG 9, which is industrialization, how it has all those linkages to other SDGs, and you can really build a industrialization strategy around SDGs as those mission targets to build around. But we don't have to talk about that at length. And here's an interesting example from UNDP, another UN agency that has thought about what does it mean for policymaking skills and capabilities in governments, in other agencies working with governments, and how do we actually think about that? And so they have developed this, the competency framework for missions or system change, which is very much sort of moving away from public sector being at arm's length and looking at what other private sector and other actors are doing, but actually being really engaged and trying to understand the system as a complex problems, and then trying to shift that system through various sort of policy of interventions. And again, as you see, it is all sort of around this idea that we learn to solve problems rather than think of, and that's what policymaking should be about. We are solving problems, but particularly we're really keen to learn how to solve the problems, and missions provide this space for this to take place. And of course, there's lots of things happening, in other policy areas, like, for instance, you can argue that greening finance has a lot to do with sort of mission-oriented thinking, both from the central bank, but also from the public bank. So KfW is a German public bank, and they have increased their green investments. So that's is a very important aspect also for central banks who are supporting markets. And you can see, and you can try to ask, how much are central banks actually, for instance, supporting greening of housing and other areas through financial sector, for instance. But there's, of course, you can think about the mission-oriented procurement as well. Here's an example from Denmark. Again, in some of those countries, public sector is spending already a lot of money through procuring food. Again, it's an interesting example how public cafeterias or public canteens in government offices, in schools, have to procure more vegetarian, more local, and more organic food. So it's providing this broad setting. It doesn't tell a producer how to do that, but it provides this market shaping, market directionality for food producers to change what they do, because this is where the market is going. They know that they can get those government products if they're government contracts, if they are changing the way they are doing food and producing food. Same here in UCL, for instance. So wherever we order catering for our events, we have to go with vegetarian food. We can't really get meat anymore. So you can shape. And of course, as I said already, cities and places are really the key areas where you have lots of innovation going on. You have Paris, obviously, this 15-minute city, but many other places as well. And here's just an example from how this sort of experimentation is. Again, we don't think about that we plan entirely new city. We're just sort of slowly actually trying to retake city space from cars and reinvent that space for bicycles, for culture, for businesses, for commerce. So it's really about doing that quite differently in different places. So it's not about top-down planning, but it's actually, as I said, providing this space. And there's lots of thinking around what type of missions are we talking about. Here's an interesting research out of Germany looking at, and some of the missions are more around the science and technology. But if you go towards the right upper corner, you have missions that are really around behavioral change, like we talk about food, for instance. What do we eat? But also mobility in societies, health. These are missions where there's lots of mixing of our social behaviors, our technologies, our environment as cities we're living in. How do we reshape that? And there's also, how do you do missions? As I said, it's very different. You have some of the missions that are very much like top-down coordinating missions. There is Horizon Europe, you can argue. There's other areas, even society. So this is a coordination agencies providing shaping the ecosystem very much. But then there are also missions that are very much focusing on sectoral sort of broader consensus making tools, like in Holland, in the Netherlands, for instance, around health. So it's building on their existing sectoral policies and making this sectoral policy more mission oriented. You have also place-based missions, as I said, a lot of cities, Camden, Valencia, Barcelona. There's lots of innovation happening in city. Some of the missions are very much led by design thinking, like Vinnova in Sweden, which is very iterative and very much trying to engage with the unusual suspects in policymaking. So when they did, for instance, the school food mission in Sweden. They engaged with school children, and their key focus is actually on teaching children in schools to think differently about food. How do they, where does it come from? How do we get it to the table? What do we do with that? What do we do with the waste? And so, of course, the idea is if you change the way school children think about food, you change the generations going forward. So it's not about telling them to do it differently, but actually teaching them and learning with them. And so we see that there's a really key new sets of capabilities emerging from governments and public actors. It's really about this capability to reframe the directionality of our socio-technical systems like food, mobility, energy. But even cities are a complex system. So can we reframe the directionality of that? Can we orchestrate the ecosystems to work together? Because if you look at many public services are provided by public and private providers. There's lots of R&D is done by private sector companies, for instance. There's always a public-private mixture, if you will. So how do we get there? I think is really important. But it's also important to seize and transform the existing resources like procurement, all the money we're already spending on like, for instance, school food and other areas. So can we actually transform those uses? And of course, can we diffuse this experimentation approach and learning across public sector organizations? So do we need to rewrite job descriptions? Do we need to rethink the way we coordinate, the way we collaborate? This requires new skills and new approaches. There's very recent publications we have put out. So if you're interested in looking at more experiences around tools that different countries have used. So we looked at we gathered together examples from Australia, Sweden, Germany, Finland. So it's mainly this tool set is mainly from European countries, so which is probably quite interesting for you. There is also a mission-oriented innovation network. Here you see some of the organizations. We are very happy to have you guys being part of our network as well. And as I said, we have always enjoyed very much working with you. So if you have any further questions, I'm very happy to answer. And yeah, thank you very much for listening.
Thank you. Thank you, Rainer.
Always a pleasure. Bye-bye.